Oedipa wondered whether, at the end of this, if it were supposed to end, she too might not be left with only compiled memories of clues, announcements, intimations, but never the central truth itself, which must somehow each time be too bright for her memory to hold, which must always blaze out, destroying its own message irreversibly, leaving an overexposed blank when the ordinary world came back.
Welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. My name is David. On this episode, I am joined by Seth from W.A.S.T.E mailing list. Seth will introduce himself in just a moment, and he will also introduce the book that we are discussing today, which is The Crying of Lot 49, Thomas Pynchon's 1966 novel. This episode is more of an appreciation of the book, including its themes, style, and possible meanings. Hopefully we provide some insight to the novel, as difficult as that may be. Without further ado, enjoy.
As you and I were talking off mic, I should say, we thought it might be worthwhile to attempt, misguided as this attempt may be, to try and provide a plot summary for readers who either are new to the novel or more likely coming to it again after a little while and might just need a bit of a primer or a refresher. So, despite the fact this is a book like interactions with a colorful assortment of characters in the Southern Californian countercultural scene, she comes to realize that W.A.S.T.E is actually the most recent iteration of a centuries-old communication system known as the Trastero, which is part of an ongoing war between battling postal services that are vying for a monopoly of control over the Californian communication highways. And in discovering this, she soon comes to a very different understanding of how the world works, and has to try and introduce some sense of clarity into an environment that is defined by its indeterminacy. So I am Seth from W.A.S.T.E mailing list. I often describe myself as a non-authoritative self-taught lover of high-density literature, and I'm a reader of anything and everything Pynchon. I run a small YouTube channel and Instagram feed, which I use as a space to discuss and analyze, usually in long form, difficult and demanding works of fiction. Suffice it to say, I feel very unqualified to be here. It is a pleasure to join you on this show this morning, and I'm really looking forward to getting into this particular author.
Excellent. Well, that makes two people entirely unqualified to talk about it, and yet we are doing so because
absolutely,
why the fuck not? So, yeah, you are a big fan of Pynchon, as your sort of moniker online indicates.
My little online handle, yes, absolutely. W.A.S.T.E mailing list.
Yeah, although it's W.A.S.T.E, lady, as one. It might have been fallopian.
I can't
remember
fallopian.
Who it was now. But yeah, that's an impossible standard to keep spelling out each letter of the acronym over and over again. So I think everyone just calls it W.A.S.T.E.
As do I in this particular circumstance. Pynchon is he is the gold standard against which all other literature I read is set, and a source of continual obsession, curiosity, and frustration all at the same time, for me personally.
Yeah, those three adjectives astutely and accurately get at this small yet dense book.
It's funny you should say that, because this is, third or fourth time around that I've read this particular novel. I had forgotten how much was crammed into this 126-page book, at least in my vintage edition here. I had always sort of regarded it in my memory from, 5-6 years ago when I first read it as sort of a text of nostalgia. Oh, it was the first Pynchon I read, the nice little small one. I had a great time with that. That spurred an interest. But going back to it again now, I realized exactly how tightly controlled and how deep he gets into the mid-60s American paranoid psyche. It's just it is fascinating how much he accomplishes in such a short period of time here.
Yeah.
And I had just kind of forgotten how much there was to really mine in this particular text.
This is my third time reading it.
Okay.
And I seem to read it every 10 years. I read it once about 20 years ago as an undergrad, 10 years ago, and then now. So I guess this is just my anniversary now for reading The Crying of Lot 49 every 10 years. And what I get out of it each time seems to be very different.
Well, I think that's one of the things that makes Pynchon fascinating is he is an author of appreciating returns. I feel like the more times you read him over, the more you will get out of it with each successive read. That has been my experience, as I understand it from the people that I've talked to about him. That tends to be a pretty common outcome for people who decide to return to his work over and over again. And even just yesterday, I just read this over in its entirety yesterday once more, just to kind of just go through it cover to cover again and see what I found. And I got more out of it yesterday than I did the week before that. It's fascinating. There's so much to explore on both the sort of the macro and the micro level in the text. And I think that's just what makes him such an enjoyable author to have readily available on the shelf.
I'm curious because I plan to read more Pynchon later, or at least coming up soon. But I wonder how much of that rereadability to discover new things works in the other novels compared to this, because it seems to fit the story itself as one of just unfolding web of connections and mystery and quest to uncover things. And as a reader, you're sort of doing that along with Oedipa, but you're also a step removed in terms of analyzing and interpreting what she is supposedly finding and analyzing as well.
Look, I think the short answer is your mileage may vary. And I think that's also contingent on the particular novel. But that being said, I think with the majority of his books, to varying degrees with each read, you will probably get more and more out of it. I think the high water mark against which the other 8 can be compared would be Gravity's Rainbow. But even in some of these smaller works, the works that people have very misguidedly referred to as Pynchon-lite. I hate that term. But they're usually referring to the California novels, which are just wildly underrated and underappreciated. Even Inherent Vice, which people wrote off as Pynchon does genre fiction. There is so much more going on in that book culturally, sociologically, economically, historically than people give it credit for. Vineland, people often malign, mostly because it just came 17 years off the back of Gravity's Rainbow, and I think they were expecting, something of a similar grandiosity and scope to that book. But there's a certain mournfulness that comes along with that book that I think is fascinating to read as a person ages. I guess this is a long-winded and circuitous way of saying, I think in most his books, you will get more with each successive reading.
And that makes sense that you are such a fan of his, considering your self-proclaimed reader of
anything and everything Pynchon.
Everything and everything Pynchon, but also, I think you said, difficult and demanding works of fiction tend to
attract my interest. Yeah, I think I get the most enjoyment out of books that leave me the most perplexed. If I come off the back of a first reading and go, what the hell did I just read? That is a fairly surefire way to know that it's something that I'm going to be thinking about for a long time afterwards. And Lot 49 is no exception to that particular rule.
Yeah, I think maybe early on as a reader, it's different, but as you develop, when you can kind of know and see all of the steps coming in a book, it tends to leave me cold. And I feel like in Pynchon, you're not going to get that.
When you say you can see all the steps coming, are you talking about a book where each act, each narrative movement is predictable in the conventional sense?
Yeah. And then also in terms of style as well, I think. But if you can feel too much and see too much what the author is doing in a way that is not... I think there's a way that it can work in certain metafictional texts where it's interesting or amusing. But if it's too obvious and I can kind of imagine each step that is the author is taking in writing, I tend to lose interest.
I think this ambiguity you described, to put it in a word, is probably aided by the author's reclusivity. The fact that we have very little information to go on about him personally, what his thought process is, what his experiences were that fed into this particular brand of what people often label as paranoid thinking. We'll probably get into this, but I don't know if paranoid's entirely the right word here. But because he has a borderline non-existent public image, we have very little to go on aside from the text itself. And I think despite the mountains of secondary academic resources we can use to bolster our understanding of books like Lot 49, the vast majority of it is just conjecture.
Yeah.
And I think most of what we'll be doing here today is conjecture, but it's enjoyable conjecture. And I would hope that people who read it, who come out wildly confused, like I did the first time, would get maybe a slightly more grounded sense of understanding as to what is going on here.
All right, then let us commence the conjecture.
Absolutely. Do you have a point in particular you would like to start at? I don't know to what extent you want to situate this book historically, or if you want to start with a basic overview of the plot. Give me an idea of where you want to work from here.
I think situating historically would be useful, and we can kind of build out from there.
Sure. As you and I were discussing in the days leading up to this recording, you and I both agree that this is a novel very much of and concerned with the 1960s. Not just the chronological 60s, but also the cultural 60s.
Yeah.
To what extent do you have an understanding of that era? I think there are a handful of very sort of signal events that occurred in the years leading up to the publication of this novel that are probably worth touching on. Would you agree?
Oh, without a doubt. And I think you see that in the characters as well. And we can sort of touch on a few of those, which is the Vietnam War and the results of that in terms of cultural impact and people's sort of mistrust of the government growing in that regard. The student riots on campuses, the civil rights movement, the assassinations of American figures who are trying to, quote unquote, change the system in some way.
You hit a lot of the key points there. If I may flesh that out slightly.
Yeah.
This was a book published in 66, set in 64, and written presumably from somewhere between the late 50s and 66 when it was published. So think about that sort of 5-6 years there. Early 60s, like you said, the perception of the Vietnam War begins to sour as the general public comes to this understanding that the war was actually a colossal waste of money, resources, and least importantly of all, human life. 61, the Soviet Union, or USSR at the time, tests the first 50 megaton hydrogen bomb, and that set off an absolute explosion, pun intended, of public and governmental suspicion toward the Soviets, a sort of third iteration of the Red Scare. You've got the Cuban Missile Crisis. 63, JFK gets assassinated. 64, Beatles appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. That's kind of the genesis of the cultural 60s and hippie movement. 65, Malcolm X is assassinated. Watts riots. There's a lot of basically reasons for the general public to become very suspicious, very mistrustful of power structures, and just kind of concerned to be in their own skin and walking among the streets of America, for lack of a better word, at the time. And one other one that I would like to highlight, which will probably become relevant later on in our discussion, is, and I do realize this came after the publication of the novel, but I think it's relevant here. October 29th, 1969, the first email message was sent via the ARPANET from UCLA to Stanford. And we'll get into a little bit why I think that's significant. But anyway, those are kind of a lot of the key points that sort of set the stage for this era of paranoid, mistrustful, countercultural thinking.
And Pynchon seems very attuned to all of these things and rather prescient in other ways, which you hinted at.
Very, I think, attuned is the right way, because he was living down there at the time, right? He was living on Manhattan, or what he refers to in his books as Gordita Beach. He said something interesting in his introduction to Slow Learner. One sentence quote here. I was beginning to shut up and listen to the American voices around me, even to shift my eyes away from printed sources and take a look at the American nonverbal reality. And I think that just goes to show that this is a guy who did have his finger on the cultural pulse of the time.
Yeah, and you see that in the different things. I didn't realize, or at least I didn't remember, that Beatlemania struck kind of at the same time that he was. You said 64 was Beatlemania?
That would
right?
be when...
Kind of the arrival.
Yeah, absolutely. That's when they really became a significant... I'm not a huge Beatles fan, but I do know that was when they became a pretty significant cultural force. What was it? Term will come to me later. But yeah, we'll refer to it for argument's sake as Beatlemania here.
But yeah, I'm thinking now of like the film Help and imagining the Paranoids as just trying to be the Beatles.
Well, it's very much what I would assume, or what I had always interpreted, they were trying to channel, right? Like when she first meets, it's not Serge. What's the first one of the Paranoids she meets?
I couldn't remember his name.
And Oedipa comments that, why are you singing with a British accent like that? So it just goes to show that they were obviously trying to channel something. And then as she's driving into San Narciso, she's listening to a song called I Want to Kiss Your Feet by, I think they were called Sick Dick and the Volkswagens. I want to kiss your feet. I want to hold your hand. It's fairly obvious what he's channeling there, right?
Yeah, nice. So seen as that period is where he situates this and how he couches all of the interactions and everything about this book in that. What does that do for the novel, do you think? How does that permeate into the text?
Well, I suppose people often refer to this as a wildly paranoid text. It's a word that's used throughout the book. It's a word that is often used in reference to him. And like I sort of alluded to before, there is very much a undercurrent of mistrust of power structures and surveillance and control systems. And you'll see that thread track through the majority of his work, namely the California novels and, of course, Gravity's Rainbow here. But I guess, and I mentioned this to you earlier in the lead up to this, if paranoia is, clinically speaking, a fear or suspicion of entities, situations, or conditions that aren't actually there, then is Lot 49 truly a paranoid text? Because it seems like a lot of the things that concerned him, particularly as it relates to surveillance on citizens' communication, is something that actually ended up coming true. You referred to this as a prescient text.
Yeah. Within the novel, Oedipa certainly seems to be concerned that this fear of her is nothing but paranoia and psychosis. In that, maybe you can read it, but I think taking that step back further as the reader and looking at her in the context of the whole and Pynchon sort of describing the culture and what is happening and what's to come, I think it's not exactly simply paranoia, right?
One of the sort of defining features of Lot 49 is its lack of resolution at the end. I often refer to this book somewhat reductively as an anti-detective novel. Pynchon has this way, particularly in the California novels, of doing what I might call genre poaching, where he takes sort of different features of popular genres of the era of media and then subverts them to kind of toy with the expectations of the reader, but to interesting and I think substantive effect. It's not just a bit of finger wagging, or probably more accurately, a middle finger to the reader. You look at something like Lot 49, where by the end, Oedipa is no closer to the source of any understanding of what waste actually is than she was at the beginning. That's arguable, but that's the way I see it. She's found about, couple dozen, hundred different sort of economic and business interests as they pertain to Pearson Verity that are intertwined with waste and the Trastero. And she realizes that this entity, waste and the Trastero, doesn't actually have one definable locus or source. And I think that's something that detective fiction gets wrong, at least in the sense of what is practically true. You know, at the end of a detective novel, you usually get to one person or one thing that is the puppeteer behind the entire apparatus of the book. But in this case, and you see this a lot in Inherent Vice as well with the Golden Fang, the deeper she gets into it, the further out its tendrils actually extend. And I think that's quite true of a lot of systems of oppression and control in real life, is that they often don't have one man, for lack of a better word, behind the entire thing. It's often a network of integrated interests all operating as sort of in circulation with one another. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it makes sense, especially considering Pynchon's own experience working for, I think you might have mentioned this, he worked for
Boeing.
Boeing, that's it, not GM. But still, the idea, I think, is still there, of these, it could be a large corporation or some sort of government apparatus that just has, like you said, I think tentacles, and each one having its own sort of brain and functioning and moving in this thing. And instead of entropy, it's almost inertia that just sort of keeps it going and keeps it spreading.
And it's interesting you use the word inertia because when Oedipa is thinking about herself at one point late in the novel, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something to the effect of she was trying to fight against her own internal sense of inertia. I'll have to dig that quote up later. But I think that's a well-positioned choice of words here. And I do think that his work at Boeing feeds very closely into a reading of Lot 49. At its most superficial level, Yo-Yo-Dine is obviously a thinly veiled allusion to Boeing. Yeah. It's I think they refer to it as an aeronautical research facility in the book down in San Narciso. So, I mean, that's pretty relevant. To get into the background here, to what extent do you want to get into Pynchon's work at Boeing? You and I talked a bit about this in our notes leading up to this, because I think it is relevant.
I think so too, actually. You seem to know a little bit more, probably a lot more actually than I do. So,
well, I'm by no means an expert. I think if you really want to get at the heart of a lot more about Pynchon's work there, two sources that are worth your time. Joshua Coman's paper, V2 to Beaumark, lays an excellent foundation for Pynchon's complicity in the military-industrial complex. But also Michael S. Judge's show, Death is Just Around the Corner. Don't know of a better Pynchon scholar than him. But here's the key points that are worth knowing leading into a reading of Lot 49. Pynchon worked at Boeing from February 1960 to September 1962. One of his jobs was to be a writer of technical articles for what was called Beaumark Service News, which is basically an internal Boeing newsletter. He's a PR guy, right? And Beaumark is an interesting project. It was a surface-to-air interceptor missile system employed in 1959 as part of a larger military defense network called SAGE. Stay with me, there is a point to this. SAGE, Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, was basically a network of computers, again, a product of the late 50s and early 60s, which was fed information from NORAD and designed to respond to an incoming Soviet airstrike. We mentioned that the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the kind of signal events that's looming over the early 60s and the writing of Lot 49. These were years when the U.S. was living in fears of a Soviet nuclear attack, and that sense of paranoia was at an all-time high. Now, while the missile defense side of this more closely feeds into a reading of Gravity's Rainbow, that's not the angle I want to take with this. SAGE acted as one of the infrastructural precursors to ARPANET, which was basically a system of networked computers run by the U.S. Department of Defense. And that would go on to become the technological basis of what we now know is the internet. This is kind of what I'm getting at with this. Inspirationally speaking, I see W.A.S.T., the communication network in Lot 49, as directly derived from SAGE. So with this as a technological backdrop of the novel, I'd propose that Lot 49 is, if in a precognizant sort of way, it's about the internet, or more specifically, the ways that people would come to use the internet as a communication system, and how that system, though convenient and powerful, is often not operating with you as the user and your best interests in mind. And I think that's kind of getting to the heart of Pynchon's attitude toward waste and the Trastero in this book. This is a network that is more than happy for you to use it, but there is a price for you using it. W.A.S.T.E and the Trastero are watching at all times. They are monitoring what you do. And if you oppose them, you will in all likelihood disappear, just like all of Oedipus' counterparts do in chapter 5, chapter 6 of the book. She realized one by one.
Yeah. They're taking all my men away is kind of how she... Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's my little digressive history lesson for you. But at least in my reading of it, I think there is something to be read into that particular perspective, for lack of a better word.
You kind of hit on something that I actually was thinking about and we discussed briefly. My first reading of this book, and this was, as I mentioned, 20 years ago, I was 19 and I was reading this, and being a 19-year-old punk rocker, I was like, oh, this is such an interesting concept, this idea of underground mail and ways to communicate. And, email was a thing. I think Facebook was still university only, and there was like little things that reminded me of it, but there was something sort of romantic and exciting about this underground communication system. And I never really looked at it from a different perspective than that. I just thought it was this kind of unique thing. Reading it now, you see what you mentioned, which is I think Pynchon is looking at this as something seemingly beneficial for these people who are relegated to the underpasses of society, both literally and figuratively. And it's actually pretty nefarious, manipulative, and ultimately used, as in the Yoyodyne, the group within Yoyodyne that still uses it, and they have to meet some sort of certain quota to maintain this unique, hip, underground communication system. They have to have this minimum number of messages or mail sent. It ends up becoming just banal and pointless.
It's bureaucratic redundancies, right? That's a little bit of
yes.
It's a little bit of Kafka showing in Pynchon's work there. This idea that it's just sort of it's business processes existing for the sake of business processes. And I do think it's interesting as well that a lot of these different factions who make use of the larger W.A.S.T.E network kind of just think that it only belongs to them. They're all in their own little bubbles. And I think that's prescient as well, because the internet is, for all intents and purposes, a series of little microcosmic echo chambers. Mm-hmm. We follow who we want to on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook and all that. And we often insulate ourselves with a collective of like-minded people, which seems to be kind of how these different factions, underground as they may be, all seem to use it as well. My favorite are they call it the Innamorati Anonymous group.
Yes. They were great. The whole story is hilarious. Yeah.
And they are basically Pynchon's version of incels. It's a group of people who have sworn off of love and just want to, it's hashtag men going their own way, right? And they are using this W.A.S.T network to connect with each other, not realizing that it exists as something larger than themselves. And I just think that's so prophetic, because where do incels all meet? They meet online. You will have to forgive me, I'm probably going to sound like a broken record, but I am very wired into this reading of Lot 49 as a sort of internet parable, for lack of a better word.
It feels like one more than ever before, which is, I think, why reading it now, as opposed to 20 years ago when this was not as, it was becoming incredibly relevant, but the fact that it seems to age, although I don't really know anything about wine, but I understand the metaphor, like fine wine. And it makes the book really quite impressive, actually, if you were to read it that way, which I think you can, and I think it holds up quite well.
And look, even if he didn't prefigure the exact way in which the internet would be used, digital communications, so on and so forth, I think he had his finger on the pulse of the idea that people will always find a way to get in touch, communicate with one another. And if business interests, being what they are, find a way to commoditize that, they absolutely will. And they will absolutely do it for a price. And I see the price in here as surveilling your communications and hoarding your data, much like they do now. You know, we see this with Cambridge Analytica only a few years ago, Facebook, one of the most primary communication tools on the planet. And as it turns out, a whole lot of our data was being bought and sold and changing hands all the time. And I think that is, whether or not he anticipated it in that particular way remains to be seen. But I think that principle of corporate business entrepreneurial malfeasance holds up to this day, because that is what W.A.S.T.E is. It's the latest iteration of the Trastero family or company, however you want to refer to them. They were essentially just a privatized mail carrier service, right?
Yeah, and who got there through violence and threats and a history of carnage, essentially. At least that's how it's portrayed in the readings Oedipus seems to get it from the books in, I can't remember the professor's library, but she picks up on the history of Trastero.
And I think it is telling that Trastero is going through truly remarkable lengths to keep their identity and their machinations concealed. They are more than happy for you to use their communication network, but they don't want you to know how they are operating and what they do behind closed doors. And I think that's very much Pynchon's rampant suspicion and mistrust of corporations and governmental systems shining through. And I think his mistrust is reasonably well placed, considering he worked for one for a number of years.
Yeah. And this, of course, this reading assumes that everything that is happening, and Oedipus is not slowly going mad or being used in some elaborate game from a dead man.
Do you think there's any merit to that reading? Because I have heard people say, like, oh, it's just a wacky drug trip, or, oh, it actually means nothing, or, you know, I've heard a bunch of different claims which are sort of spinning off of this idea that is anything here actually a reflection of reality. Do you think there's an argument to be made there?
Not really, actually. I can see that reading, and I think Pynchon himself throws that possibility into the mix because he enjoys throwing possibilities into the mix. Near the end, when Oedipus meets Fallopian, he suggests maybe this is all one giant practical joke by Inverarity, which, for a thought, it's interesting, but I don't think it holds much water as an argument or as a reading of the novel.
And I think it is noteworthy that you say that Pynchon is the one who inserts that particular sense of doubt into the text, because this can relate back to another pretty significant concept in the book, which would be Maxwell's demon, right?
Yeah.
Maxwell's demon and entropy as sort of the primary dueling forces in the novel. I think that's even more significant than the war waged between Turn and Texas and Trastero. Mm-hmm. And you and I were talking a little bit about, what actually is the demon in this book? And I think there's about a half dozen different ways that you can read it. But I think Pynchon is the source of entropy. He's the one introducing the noise into the signal. This is a book that doesn't need to have this many red herrings or convoluted plot machinations, but it does very intentionally. And so I think there is a point of significance there that the noise does serve a greater purpose as it relates to this idea of this demon being an information sorting machine. I don't know. How do you read the demon, where we sort of seem to be at odds about what we think that actually means in relation to the text as a whole?
So I think you're right. Reading Pynchon as the demon and the novel as the closed system, and him sorting the information in the way that he chooses feels right. there's a way to see Oedipa as the demon attempting to do that.
An information sorting machine.
Yeah, I mean, essentially that's what she's trying to do, and somewhat succeeding, I would say. But in the end, not really. Although, in the end is a weird turn of phrase, because the book doesn't necessarily have an end.
She sorts the information well, but I don't think she gets any closer to the source.
Yes.
She's sort of spinning plates the entire time. And, she's presented with an enormous wealth of what I might call entropic information. And in true neo-noir detective fashion, she's trying to delineate all this evidence she's been presented with into what is a red herring, what is a dead end, and what might actually lead me some closer to the truth. But I think she's sort of on a bit of a spiral here where she'll go around and around the source, but never quite touch it. There's this series of interludes that Pynchon inserts into Gravity's Rainbow. He calls them proverbs for paranoids. And I think the last one reads, "You may never reach the master, but you may tickle his creatures," which is hilarious and silly and classically Pynchon in its irreverence. But I think that idea plays in quite nicely here. I think that was something that he actually kind of blossomed out of this particular book. The idea that you can get close, but you're never going to quite get to the source of what is going on here. And Doc experiences this quite significantly in Inherent Vice as well, as he tries to get to the root of the Golden Fang, right?
Yeah. And in a way, as I kind of mentioned, Oedipus serves as a bit of a reader surrogate in that regard, the same way a lot of detectives do in detective fiction. But I think as a reader who's sort of at least familiar with Pynchon or this kind of work, having that additional layer of knowledge of this book being something more than what it seems to be makes it a much more pleasurable read, where I think there are people who go into it expecting to get answers at the end who would feel incredibly frustrated coming to that ending. That on the doorstep of revelation, the very almost religious altar-like scene, and then just cutting you off.
That's the game that he plays in all of his books, though, right? And I think that is actually where he has a degree of commercial intelligence as an author. And I say commercial insofar as I can't think of really a single book of his where he gives us a super straight answer at the end. The only one I can think of maybe would be Vineland, where at the end he does offer some degree of resolution, because that book is, for all intents and purposes, an elegy for the death of the counterculture. But that is his MO, for lack of a better word. Is not only does he want his characters chasing their own tails, but he wants you as the reader to do it as well. There's a mischievousness and a playfulness that comes along with the serious concerns he has about the world in which he's writing this book. And I think that's these books rather. And I think that's what sets him apart from other authors who take themselves extremely seriously. Is while I do think he has serious concerns, I think he's more than willing to have fun with them and make fun of himself and make fun of the reader along the way. And I think that's part of what makes him such a unique force, is I think a lot of people who operate on his same frequency of what people might call metafictional or postmodern concern often get very into the nitty-gritty of it all, for lack of a more eloquent turn of phrase. Don't know if you agree on that or not.
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. I think this book, and Pynchon seems to be poking fun at everything and everyone, including the book you're reading and himself as an author. He's got a very, very wry sense of humor, I think, as well. There are moments in this that are, I mean, a lot of it is, serious, but also just absurd, from character naming to situations to the parody of Yo-Yo-Dine to making fun of the counterculture itself. And he tends to make fun of it in terms of, I think, ego-driven narcissism, which is a word maybe we need to get into.
That is absolutely.
But yeah, he makes fun of everybody and everything, and it's great, honestly.
And that making fun of everyone, we're touching on whether or not to describe his writing style and that irreverence. People often throw around the term postmodern. I don't particularly like the word because I think it's just been diluted to mean anything big, difficult, and complex. 99.9% of the time written by an elderly white dude.
Yeah.
I have taken recently to referring it to as either hysterical realism or Menippean satire. I put a little note of that in our notes here. And Menippean satire is just basically a form of satire that attacks mental attitudes rather than specific individuals or entities. I don't know if it entirely pertains there, because I think he is most definitely maybe not attacking, but exposing particular entities, in this case, control and surveillance systems of governmental or privatized origin, but also interested in sort of toying with the paranoid mindset. Whether or not that's an accurate term here, I think it's an easy signifier to latch onto, because there is a pretty substantive degree of looking over one's shoulder while reading this book, both for the reader and for Oedipa as the not the narrator, but the viewpoint character. This might be worth touching on as well. Pynchon's clouded in a degree of, I think, anxiety for prospective readers, and he's somewhat lionized as being incredibly difficult. And I could see people potentially coming to a supplement such as this as sort of a primer to approach a text.
Yeah.
What do you think about that assertion? I don't think there's any argument that Pynchon is difficult. Do you think his difficulty is part of, if not essential to why he has the stature that he does, why people choose to reread him so much?
Difficulty lends to rereading, certainly, but not entirely. I think difficulty with substance is really what makes it sort of stand the test of time. And I would say that the difficulty is warranted if you're trying to read Pynchon for the first time and you start with Gravity's Rainbow, at least for a lot of people. For myself, I remember being an undergrad, reading Crying of Lot 49 and going, oh, this was amazing. I'm going to go read Gravity's Rainbow immediately. And then giving up after about 75, 100 pages. I was like, I can't do this right now. I'll read it later. And then, of course, never getting to it because life happens.
Gravity's Rainbow is a very inadvisable start to Pynchon. I think that is the greatest way to put people off of Pynchon. I almost always recommend Lot 49 as the starting point, not just because of its length. I think it's significant for a couple of reasons, but one of them is also because it's the very first novel of his where his patented style that now has its own name, Pynchonian, truly emerges. I like V. I think it's a perfectly good book, but I think it is mostly him workshopping ideas that would emerge here, would come out in Gravity's Rainbow, and so on and so forth. I think this is the first most tightly controlled conspiratorial thinking book that he created. And that's why I almost always direct people to it. And it's noisy, but it's noisy by intention. Because again, if you want to get back to that Maxwell's Demon reading of it, I think the noise is a critical portion of the text for both Oedipa and the reader.
And going back to that Maxwell's Demon thing, do you imagine Pynchon throwing all of these wrenches into it, putting entropy into the text itself? What sort of purpose does that serve? As a reader approaching it, why would that be something worth reading? Because I think if this is the first time you're thinking about reading this book and you're sort of getting into Pynchon in general, what's the appeal of reading something that has no answer, that is filled purposefully with misdirection in your mind?
Oh, I think in a way, it's the question of the book as well. Why is there so much randomness and noise and polyphonic overlapping of voices and societal concerns in this book? And I think it's possible that that's there because that is simply a reflection of what life is. You've got, 40, 50 characters in this book, something like that, all with a pretty substantive degree of diverted interests from one another. They all seem to want different things, but they have one thing in common. They all meet at the common marketplace known as waste. They all communicate using the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that is possibly something he was seeing in the counterculture at the time, because the counterculture it wasn't one thing, and it very much became a crystallized, fractal, shattered mosaic of different social concerns by the end of the 80s. That's primarily what Vineland has to do with, is how this one sort of unifying force ended up breaking down into a bunch of different things that no longer had anything to do with each other, but they were still blanketed under this one idea of the counterculture, this one moniker. And so I think maybe one of the many ways you could read it is he's interested in the way that things that seemingly aren't connected to one another potentially do have some shared interests or mutual concerns, for lack of a better word, sort of how we're similar and how we're different at the same time. And much like a Pynchon novel, that answer got bigger and bigger and bigger and didn't really answer your question at all. So I think it's appropriate for this particular book. It's a hard question. And I guess that's part of what makes him interesting, is that I don't know. I think it is possibly the question of the book, and not something that you can answer easily.
I agree. And I wouldn't know how to begin to answer that question other than, I think, exploring the possibilities of it is just a fun thing to do, honestly. To read into these layers of meaning and allusion and reference, and to watch these people, these characters overlap and crisscross and share that thing that is waste, and yet still in this secretive, elaborate system of communication to not really communicate with one another at all. It's kind of, it's sad and it's funny.
Well, those are two of his most common emotional register, is sort of mournfulness and melancholy and humor, often operating in parallel with one another. And I think you touched on one of the main interests of the book, perhaps, is you said how these people are communicating, or rather how they're miscommunicating with one another. And I think that's a pretty notable thematic interest of the book. There's that line that Driblet says, or Driblet, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, the guy who wrote the Courier's, excuse me, he directed the Courier's Tragedy. Yeah. He's in the shower.
Given it's Pynchon-lite, it's got to be Driblet. Just because it's funny.
Yeah, of course. And he says to Oedipa, you guys, you're like Puritans about the Bible, so hung up with words. The words, who cares? They're rote noises to hold line bashes with. And it's funny that an author whose primary mode of communication, or rather only mode of communication with the world at large, is exactly that, words. It's almost it's a jab at the people who use waste, and in its own way, it's a jab at himself. And again, I think there is, if you want to read deeply enough into it, quite a through line of guilt throughout Pynchon's work, because he was implicated in the military-industrial complex. He worked at Boeing during the development of these projects of military, obviously the missile defense systems that we spoke of earlier, and this formation of the internet. And I think it's possibly kind of, to a much, much lesser degree, a sort of Robert Oppenheimer moment, like, what the hell have I created here? Or at least been a part of what's been created here. And I think maybe he holds a degree of personal responsibility to his involvement with what the world became, to put it in a sentence or two.
I'd have to read more up about his actual involvement, but I wonder if being simply the editor for a newsletter for such a corporation, I mean, no doubt would leave some mark on you, but can't imagine it would be
it could be
a heavy amount.
It could be entirely misdirected, and I could just be expanding a more significant emotional register than he actually felt. It's hard to say what his degree of involvement actually was.
True. Nonetheless, I think you're right that sense is in the work.
Yeah.
That feeling, the characters feel it. There's a sense of guilt and, I would say,
complicity,
disappointment, and complicity. Yeah. That's definitely there as well.
I do wonder though how much Pynchon actually did while working there. There is this article that has been all but scrubbed from the internet. I think it's Jules Siegel, who was Pynchon's one-time college roommate at Cornell, who wrote this book called Who is Thomas Pynchon? Or this article, Who is Thomas Pynchon and Why Did He Run Off with My Wife? It was published in Playboy, can't remember what decade. And one thing he notes there is that in his time living with Pynchon, he was always scared. And he asked him at one point, he said, why are you always concerned with the stuff that you've been writing in your notoriety? That will absolutely get you out of any trouble you get into. And allegedly, Pynchon gave him this oblique answer that suggested something to the effect of, he didn't think his writing would get him out of trouble. He thought his writing would get him into trouble. So maybe it's less so about what he actually did at Boeing and more so the fact that he was exposing it, albeit indirectly, through texts like Lot 49, which sort of begs a further question. Why does he hold it in such a low regard now? You familiar with what he has to say about the book now?
Yeah, you mentioned his intro in Slow Learner, and I remember I've read Slow Learner long ago, and I remember reading the introduction to it, but if memory serves, I feel like the introduction was how I imagined Pynchon to be and somewhat facetious. Like, I didn't believe what he was writing in his own introduction, if that makes sense.
So you think it's a giant misdirection? That would be appropriate
a little
for
bit.
The guy who wrote Lot 49, considering it's a book that's characterized by its misdirection.
It certainly feels that way.
If you want to view it as a piece of referential material designed to misdirect the audience who reads it, then could we say from this that he doesn't actually hold Lot 49 in a low regard? It's possible that he actually thinks it's more impactful than he's giving it credit for. You know, there's a school of thought for the more conspiratorial among us that he's actually potentially scared of the ramifications that could have come from a text like this. I don't want to get too much into this particular thread because I don't know enough about this to weigh on it too heavily, but there is a faction of people who exist on some of the darker corners of the internet message boards who do believe that Lot 49 is a coded text referring to the JFK assassination. Do with that information what you will. But I think it's an interesting...
I will appreciate that it exists.
Yes.
Probably as far as my...
Exactly. I haven't looked too far into it because I think that's just one too many rabbit holes to be going down.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. But that's just probably as far as it'll get, is to be an interesting tidbit of information.
Yeah.
So I feel we got about an hour worth of us pontificating here.
And are no closer to understanding what this book is actually about, which is probably the point. At least I can't speak for you, but I feel like there's always going to be a giant question mark hanging over the cover of Lot 49 for me.
Yeah, that is part of its appeal.
No, absolutely. It is something that is designed to keep you questioning, and it's why you're coming back to it every 10 years, and me, I guess, every 5, give or take.
Yeah. Is there anything else you feel like we need to discuss? I mean, I feel like there's so much we can get into.
Yes, my answer is yes. There is so much more to discuss, but we don't need to make this a 3-hour podcast.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Seth, thank you for joining me. That was a pleasure.
David, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for having me. It was a privilege to be on a show I've been listening to for quite a long time now, so hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, we'll have to do it again for Gravity's Rainbow maybe next year.
Oh, dear God. That's the one you want to bring me on for? Good Lord. All right, see you.
Thanks for listening. To find out more about Seth, you can find him at his handle @W.A.S.T.E mailing list on YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. Definitely check out his YouTube channel. It's excellent with great in-depth analysis of books and some current and future excellent interviews with authors and translators. You can find more info about the podcast at our website, booksofsomesubstance.com. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at booksosubstance. Until next time, happy reading.
Someone in my building keeps slamming their damn door, and I'm sorry if that comes up on the recording.